Hello, everyone. Um, with school being closed, we decided that we were still going to be learning about the American Revolution. So we're going to be making some helpful YouTube videos where we can learn more about it. Clearly, this isn't school, this is my house, and we'll be reading and learning from here. The first book we will be reading will be King George. What was his problem? The whole hilarious story of the American Revolution. How to start a revolution. Entire books have been written about the causes of the American Revolution. You'll be glad to know this isn't one of them. But you really should understand how the whole thing got started. After all, if you ever find yourself ruled by someone like King George, you'll want to know exactly what to do. So here's a quick step-by-step guide to starting a revolution. Step 1. Kick out the French. Let's pick up the action in 1750. Britain, France, and Spain had carved up North America into massive empires. As you can see on the map below, you think they'd be satisfied, right? But Britain and France both wanted to see their names on even more of the map. Let's face it, they both wanted the whole map. It didn't bother them that most of the land actually belonged to the Native Americans. To Britain and France, this seemed like a good reason to fight a war. You can call that the French and Indian War or the 7 Years' War. Either way, the British won. Britain took over most of France's land in North America. For Britain, that was good news. Step 2. Tax the colonists. Well, before we read this, we need to learn a little bit more about what the 13 colonies were and who the colonists were. The 13 colonies were made up of Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, New York, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. All of the colonies were sick and tired of King George ignoring them and taxing them without any representation. Alright, let's get back to our story. Step 2. Tax the colonist. Here's the bad news. War is really expensive. The British were left with a mountain of debt. And now they had to keep 10,000 soldiers in North America to protect all their new land. That's not cheap. The British Prime Minister, George Grenville, started thinking of ways to raise some quick cash. You can guess the idea that he came up with, can't you? That's right. He decided to tax the colonists. Grenville really felt that the 13 colonies owed Britain the money. Grenville's plan was called the Stamp Act. When colonists signed any legal document or brought paper goods like newspapers or books or even playing cards, they would have to buy stamps too. The stamps showed that you had paid the tax. A few members of Parliament warned that the Stamp Act might spark protests in the colonies. But young King George III, he was only 22, liked the idea. And he did not expect any problems. Step 3. Hang the taxman. King George never did understand Americans. No one likes a tax increase, no matter what the reason. Besides, the 13 colonies had pretty much been governing themselves for years. And self-government obviously included coming up with their own taxes. So colonists started shouting a slogan, "No taxation without representation," meaning basically, we're not paying. Shouting is easy, but how do you actually avoid paying taxes? Samuel Adams of Boston had that all figured out. Adams was in his early 40s, and he hadn't really found anything he was good at yet. His father once gave him 1,000 pounds, that's a lot of money, to start a business. Samuel loaned half of it to a friend who never paid him back. It's safe to say, Samuel had no talent for business. All he wanted to do was write about politics and argue in town meetings. But how far could that really get you in life? Pretty far, actually. Because when the time came to protest the Stamp Act, Adams was ready to take the lead. He figured it like this: the Stamp Act is supposed to go into effect in November of 1765, right? Well, what if there was no one around to distribute the stamps? Then we won't have to buy them. Plain and simple. The job of distributing the stamps in Boston belonged to a man named Andrew Oliver. When Oliver woke up one morning in August, he was informed that a full-size Andrew Oliver doll was hanging from an elm tree in town. Pinned to the doll was a poem. What greater joy did New England see than a stamp man hanging from a tree? It got worse. That night, a crowd of Bostonians, yelling about taxes, cut down the doll and carried it to Oliver's house. They chopped off its head and set it on fire. Then they started breaking Oliver's windows. As you can imagine, Andrew Oliver found this whole experience fairly frightening. He wasn't so eager to start collecting any of the stamp taxes in Boston. That was exactly how Adams had planned it. Similar scenes took place all over Boston in the 13 colonies. Calling themselves the Sons of Liberty, protesters gave plenty of the stamp agents the Andrew Oliver treatment. The agents quit as fast as they could. And can you blame them? So when the tax went into effect, there was no one around to collect it. Step 4. Try again. Back in London, the British government was forced to face a painful fact. There was no money in this Stamp Act deal. Parliament voted to repeal, or to get rid of, the tax. King George reluctantly approved of the decision. The colonists celebrated the news with feasts and dances. Boston's richest merchant, a guy named John Hancock, gave out free wine and put on a fireworks show outside of his house. The happy people of New York City built a statue of King George and put it in the city park. Remember that statue? It's going to come back later in this story. What the colonists didn't realize was that the British leaders were already talking about a new tax. After all, the British government still needed money, and most leaders still insisted that Britain had every right to tax the Americans. King George was especially firm on this point. He was a very stubborn fellow. So, Parliament passed the Townshend Acts in 1767. When colonist merchants found out about this, they were very, very upset. The tax was on things like paint, paper, glass, and tea. They would have to pay a tax based on the value of each item. Or would they? Step 5. Refuse to pay. Rather than pay the new taxes, colonists started boycotting or refusing to buy British imports. Women were the driving force behind these boycotts. Hannah Griffith of Pennsylvania expressed the determination of many colonists in a poem. John Hancock found another way to get around paying taxes. Hancock simply snuck all of his goods past the tax collectors. He knew that smuggling was illegal, but he didn't feel too guilty about it. To Hancock, smuggling seemed like a fair response to an unfair law. Of course, the British wanted to stop smugglers like Hancock. But you had to remember, colonists really hated these taxes. So any British official who tried too hard to collect taxes was taking a serious risk. Think of poor John Malcolm, for example. This British official was stripped to the waist, smeared with hot tar, and covered with feathers from a pillow. Then he was pulled through Boston in a cart, just to make the humiliation complete. What was the worst thing about getting tarred and feathered? Malcolm said it was just so painful. He mailed a box of his tar and feathers with bits and pieces to the British government in London. They sympathized and then sent him money. Then in the spring of 1768, Hancock's ship, Liberty, full of smuggled wine from France, was seized by tax agents in Boston. Various members of the Sons of Liberty gathered at the docks where Sam Adams was heard shouting, "If you are a man, behave like men. Let us take up arms immediately and be free." The sons spent the night throwing stones at the tax collectors' houses. They even dragged a tax agent's boat out of the water and lit it on fire in front of John Hancock's house. The terrified taxman escaped to an island in Boston Harbor. Step 6. Send in the warships. King George did not appreciate this form of protest. The world's most powerful country can't have its government employees hiding on islands. It just wasn't a good look. It was time to get tough with the colonists. In the words of Frederick North, one of the king's favorite advisors, Americans must fear you before she can love you. Why not just repeal the Townshend Acts? I hope we shall never think of it, snapped North, till we see America down at our feet. North was another guy who didn't understand Americans. In October of 1768, British warships sailed into Boston Harbor. Under the command of General Thomas Gage, 1,000 British soldiers marched off the ships and paraded through the town in their bright red coats, beating drums and dragging cannons. That should have solved everything, right? Well, nothing too serious happened until March of 1770. On March 2nd, a British soldier named Patrick Walker was looking for a little extra work in Boston. The soldiers back then were paid almost nothing. He stopped by a rope walk, an outdoor workshop where ropes were being made, and spoke to the rope maker named William Green. Green said, "Soldier, do you want work?" Walker said, "Yes." Green said, "Well then, go clean my outhouse." Only Green didn't say outhouse. He used the word I can't print here. Walker was quite offended. He got a group of soldiers together and they attacked the rope maker with wooden clubs. The rope maker fought back in the club with clubs of their own, and it was an ugly scene. The point of the story is simple. The British soldiers and the people of Boston were not getting along, and it's easy to see why. The soldiers were in town to enforce laws that people were furious about, and people took their anger out on the soldiers. Did the soldiers deserve such hatred? Maybe not. Most were 17 and 18-year-old boys from poor families. This was the only job they could get, and they hated being in Boston just as much as the people hated having them. On the night of March 5th, 1770, 3 days after the rope walk fight, all the anger in Boston exploded into violence. All right, everyone. I think that's where we're going to stop in our story today, and we're going to pick up tomorrow to see what happens with the British soldiers and the American colonists. All right. Have a nice day.